Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are on this fast forward planet, still wrapped in a pandemic. I'd like to be able to not say that anymore after 2.5 years of saying it on this show. People with a B without a single shot. Well, people like me, fortunate, privileged people, I've had my fourth. I'm what we say in Yiddish, an altakak, or an old guy, and so I ahead of the curve to some extent on that. One of my sons just had COVID. It's pervasive still. It's an overheating planet. It's a human heated planet. It's wrapped in a very noisy information ecosystem. Some call it an infodemic. The World Health Organization does. And media in the middle of all this have faced all kinds of challenges and opportunities. Today, you're going to focus on an opportunity that's being exploited wonderfully by a 16-year-old venture called Global Press, Institute Journal. It's a publishing platform. It's a support system for a worldwide network of female journalists. Normally, historically, I would have said in developing countries mostly, but we're going to learn why it's important to examine the words we use. And sometimes the words we just sort of rely on as a shortcut, because within developing countries, within any country, you have undeveloped poverty, zones of complete disarray, and areas of privilege, and the words we choose can harm both indirectly and directly if it's a subject of bias. Or we'll learn about the word refugee and different words for that. But Global Press Journal and Global Press are just, to me, a really great case study in breaking old norms. Just not putting up a website and doing the same thing. I'm here today with my colleague Dale Willman from the Resilience Media Project that we have at Columbia University. I'm Andy Revkin, Columbia Climate School, Earth Institute, and my guests happily are Cristi Hegranes, who's the founder and CEO and publisher of Global Press. Hello. And it's been a while. And Lakshmi Parthasarathi, who is the COO and is a well, you're married to a good friend too, so that's great. You have one of the. I think on Twitter I called you like a superpower. You're a renewable power couple because your husband does. So it's just great to be able to have a conversation today about what you do and how you've done it so far. I'm going to show that introductory. There's a little bit of a teaser video that you've produced that I think is a really good summary to start with. So hold on one second, and you can just say good morning while I set that up. Cristi, how are you anyway?
I'm well, Andy. Thank you. How are you? It's so great to be with you.
I'm good. It's hard to believe how long this stretch has been, but I think trying to make the most of the online connectedness through this whole time has been important, and it keeps me sane.
Absolutely.
Moving these. So, and hold on.
It's great to be here, and it's great to see that the show is still going strong, Andy.
It is indeed, and Dale is just back from Pakistan, where he's involved with the Center for Excellence in Journalism, and a training project as well. So actually, Cristi, why don't you just start in with a little, how did this happen 16 years ago? What led you to the idea, and then we'll talk about the iterations through time.
Sure. So growing up, all I ever wanted to be was a foreign correspondent. It was my dream job. I wanted to travel the world telling its stories. And when I got my first shot in the early 2000s in Nepal, I realized pretty quickly that I was not the right person to be telling the stories. I lacked context, access, social, historical, linguistic context to really tell the dignified, precise stories that this community needed. And as I really started to investigate, the history of parachute journalism and just what role it actually serves in the info ecosystem, as you were mentioning earlier, I just really realized that it was a prime moment to pass the pen and to find local journalists who had all of those things that I lacked. And if they had a robust training opportunity and then a professional global platform, we could really reimagine the craft of international journalism to change the storyteller, which would so dramatically change the story and would change the way that people everywhere understood the world and their places in it. So over the last 16 years, we have built 37 independent news bureaus across the world, from rural Mongolia to Democratic Republic of Congo to 7 states in Mexico. all staffed by 100% women journalists who are uniquely suited with the context and the access to tell the stories of their communities that locally people really need to hear, and globally really helps to disrupt traditional narratives about their parts of the world.
And what was the driving force behind making the reporting network all female?
So, and Lakshmi can talk a bit more about this as we get into the show, but I think the way that we really think about who should be telling the story is we go into a community and we essentially do two analyses. First and foremost, who lives in this community? Who are the people here? And then on top of that, we overlay who owns and controls the media? Who are the working journalists in this community? And there is always a disconnect, right? We see that disconnect deeply in the United States. That same disconnect exists in other parts of the world. So we overlay those two studies, and then we ask a really simple question: who's missing? And in nearly every media market on earth, women are missing in terms of really building out representative newsrooms. So that's the goal, is that by bringing women into positions of storytelling prominence, journalistic prominence in the world, we can really round out the types of stories that we get from the world and how we understand the world. So just really pushing that narrative beyond war, poverty, disaster, disease. Our reporters, who you'll hear from in just a second, are really deeply capable and deeply powerful in their abilities to tell stories about things like healthcare and education, and of course climate.
So I'll play a little bit of the video here, just so we get a sense of that.
Through what we learn at Global Press, it has brought us together as one family.
As readers continue to demand equity, inclusion, and better representation from media, these extraordinary reporters will continue to lead the way, bravely reporting the untold stories so that we can better understand each other and better understand our world.
And it's now, as you said, I think 40 bureaus, is that right? Something
37, like yes, 37.
Amazing.
With a bunch more coming later this year, and then into the coming years as well. The pandemic obviously slowed us down a little bit in terms of opening new bureaus, but we are, thanks to Lakshmi and her team, finding new ways to get back at it.
So Lakshmi, to fill us in a little bit on how this happens. It's one thing to say, let's create a website, let's do training, let's build a global network of newsrooms populated by female journalists. But how does it actually happen?
Yeah, I think that the global press model is extremely unique. We're making long-term investments in the health of a local media market. So Cristi alluded to this idea of just how we really assess what the health of that local media market is. So we look at 4 different types of media markets. We look at saturated news markets. We look at unfree societies, transitioning political environments, and news deserts. And in some places and cases, all 4 of those are true. So sometimes we have a tendency to, think that, well, Mongolia must be one type of media market. Actually, we're in Gobi Desert, where it's literally a news desert, and Erdenet, where it's a news desert. And we're also in Ulaanbaatar, which is an oversaturated media market. But as Cristi was mentioning, we're really looking at who are the journalists of record in those communities. Are they well paid? Do they have strong living wages? Do they have benefits? Do they have the infrastructure and support that they need in order to create great journalism? And what we do is ensure that they do have all of those tools in order to be incredible reporters. We need to build the right infrastructure around them, which is made up of tools such as technology and reporting tools. It's about being connected to a global editorial network. It's about having, as I mentioned, strong living wages, benefits, and incredible programs such as our Duty of Care program at Global Press. All of this really makes up a unique environment for reporters to really create the most incredible journalism that they can from their local communities. And we also, we really rely on their proximity to their communities to determine what stories they're going to tell. We have a really unique non-assignment policy in our newsroom, which ensures that those local reporters are also in control of the stories that are being told from their communities. It ensures that we're really capturing the essence of what those communities care about. We often talk about, we create stories that are often not for the people that we're writing about. And so in global press, we're really flipping that model on its head entirely, looking at who is the storyteller, who gets the byline, and who is the audience for that story. And we always prioritize our local audience and ensure that the local context and historical knowledge and expertise that our local reporters are providing are also reaching a global audience through a network of news partnerships with organizations like Quartz, BBC World Service. There's tons of others across the United States, the UK, and locally as well.
Yeah, and we're going to bring in Dale here in a minute to talk about some other models he's worked on over the years for training and fostering journalism. What's really captivated me about your model is exactly what you're describing here. Among other things, it's so different than like the BBC hiring a local stringer to tell a story to BBC listeners or the Times or whoever, and facing the multiple markets at the same time. And you do a lot of there's a lot of translation now too. Is that right? There's 25 languages or so, but you also present the work in English, et cetera.
Yeah, so we actually publish all of our stories in English, but also the local reporter's language. So we publish in 6 different languages, which, you can find that right on globalpressjournal.com where our stories are published. Every story that is reported by a reporter in Mongolia is also available in Mongolian. And, that requires a real investment in interpretation, in translation, and in our incredible network that we call the Global Press Accuracy Network. So this is a team of fact checkers, copy editors, translators, and interpreters that really strengthen every piece that our local reporters are working on and ensure an incredibly accurate final story.
Yeah, I love those words, accuracy and dignity, that are really at the heart of what you're trying to do. We'll get into words in a few minutes. So Dale, I wanted to bring you in here you've had a long career in journalism and public radio and in other media. You're working on resilience journalism training and facilitation now. You just got back from Pakistan in March to do some work with the Center for Excellence in Journalism through Medill, I think. What's this sort of the landscape out there, and what do you see as being particularly noteworthy about this one? Or what else catches your eye?
Well, global press is I think the model that everybody should aspire to. I love what they're doing, and it's different from the kind of work I've been doing in the sense that I've been doing on the ground training. But we'll get into the style guide that Global Press has developed, which I think is the most fantastic thing. I've been trying to get someone to do stories on this because I think what they're doing, words matter, and the way we define issues, the way we frame them matters, and that's at the heart of what the style guide's about. But there's in listening to both of you talk, Lakshmi and Cristi, is it's sort of you're drilling down and you're becoming local and really making sure that the local community understands and is informed, and that's so critical. In Pakistan, one of the things that we talked about is not only providing these local stories, but we're trying to connect the primarily freelancers we're working with there with international markets as well, because it's important that the local community understand. It's empowering. It helps them make decisions. It gives them the ability to make informed decisions when it comes to politics and their leaders. But it's also important because these areas are so underreported in the national media to get those voices out and heard, instead of the parachute journalism that we see so often, in which you alluded to, and people just, by that they mean just dropping in, doing the story, running. Another name for that is extractive journalism. They're not a part of the community, they don't understand the community, they take knowledge, they leave with it. So if we can begin to connect these local reporters with their incredible knowledge of community and sense of place with these international outlets and find ways to get them in those markets as well with the stories they're already producing locally, I think that's the next step that would make that this powerful model even more so. And I know you're thinking in those directions too, but it's It's one of the most significant things we need to do right now. We need to get the rest of the world to understand what's happening in these places, especially when we're talking about climate change, because it's the polar regions and it's the equatorial regions that are most drastically and immediately affected. And yet those where so many people live, but so many people making decisions for the world live outside of those areas. So we need to get them to understand, to see this, to understand, to respond to it. And that's I think the next huge step.
And I wanted to bring
so
up.
True.
Sorry, you keep.
No, I was just going to say, Dale, that's so true. You know, what we see so often is people in our coverage communities often lack significant access to information about climate realities in their community due to language access or internet access. But there are so many innovative solutions happening in these communities as well that the world can really learn from as well. So I think if we could find more mutuality in how international journalism is produced, local communities have a lot to gain and benefit from having greater access to information, but also the world benefits significantly from having greater access to information about these parts of the world that are typically only covered in the very stereotypical paradigm of, you know, war and disaster.
Well,
There's
people
so
talk
many-
about their own. Sorry, talk about their own self-interest. You know, we always think about our own self-interest, but particularly when it comes to climate change, the modeling that's happening, the projects that are happening in these other parts of the world that we're not hearing about, could be the leading edge of the technology that the rest of the world needs to begin to adapt to what's happening.
I mean, we know that a one-size-fits-all model is not going to work in every local community in the world, and so, you know, stories that we're producing really show the ingenuity and innovation in local communities that, you know, small communities in Mexico might learn from, you know, small communities in Mongolia. But we have to have local reporters covering those climate responses locally.
Yeah, and this gets to one of the important points I think that comes up in your style guide, which is, I guess mostly you see words that are generalist words, like climate catastrophe, climate disaster, climate breakdown, even climate adaptation. The words only really, you miss the rich variety on the ground. In Bangladesh, for example, there's such interesting innovations in like moving from farming chickens to farming ducks. That's a great story. And it shows you how you, on the ground, you can innovate around, you know, keeping a livelihood going with a changing water situation. Same thing in Bangladesh with flood resilience. They've been hammered by cyclones steadily since 1970 when they lost 200,000 people, and they lose now. The losses, they're still terrible each one, but they're in the dozens because of the capacity to do things locally. And so we miss the big media, miss those stories. So let's talk about the style guide, because again, I think it's one of the key innovations you've come up with. And we'll talk about duty of care in a minute. I showed that award you guys just got. But what led to this? Because this is, Cristi, this is almost like just getting started with the whole project itself. I grew up in the New York Times. Like the New York Times, just briefly, in 2008, 2010 or so, we started doing something that I thought was exciting, where if you click on the word climate change in a Times story, it would go to a topics page where we offered readers the definition of climate change that we use at the Times. And now you click on that word and all it goes is to a list of other climate stories. So you don't have any sense of what we, the Times, meant when we said a word. So how did this come about? Because then we lost that, all went away. It's like, oh my God, we went in the wrong direction. You're going in the right direction.
I mean, I think that these notions of dignity and precision are absolutely central to what the future of journalism has to be built on. And also those two words as inextricably linked. We as journalists have an extraordinary responsibility to find the most dignified words to describe the people and the places we're talking about, but also the most precise words that allow for reader clarity to understand places that may not be familiar to them. So the premise of the Global Press Style Guide is it is intended to be a companion to the Associated Press Style book, but every single entry in the Global Press Style Guide is a deviation from AP style. either because we have written an entry where AP is silent, or where we disagree that AP has missed the mark and their entry on a particular topic could be more dignified or more precise. So, the guide is really founded on 3 decision-making principles, right? Number 1, we cannot, in international journalism in particular, but in all journalism, we cannot use words that force people to make assumptions. So, Andy, at the top of the show, you mentioned the term developing world.
Right.
Developing world, global south. These are words that we do not use at Global Press. I'll tell you, it's really interesting. Last year, we did some US audience research on our readers who live within the United States. And we polled a nationwide sample of people on the term global south. And do you know what percentage of people within the United States could correctly define the term global south?
I won't even bother to guess. I bet it's very, very low.
It's 0. It is
0.
0.
Wow.
0% of a nationwide sample of people living within the US know what the global south is. And so in this focus group, when moderators pushed and they said, well, what do you think it means? What the assumptions that people made about what the global south was dangerous. It was just straight up dangerous. So what we know to be true, and something that might feel a little bit uncomfortable to say out loud, but the terms developing world and global south, they're essentially sanitized synonyms for poverty, right? When we use those terms, what we mean is like people in places over there who are not like us, who have all kinds of problems, right? And if you really think about it, when you say global south, are you talking about places where there is abject poverty? Let's say challenges to free, fair elections, places where millions of people lack access to, say clean water. Well, I just described the United States with those 3 sentences. So what we really have to do as journalists is say, what are we talking about, right? We get pushback on this entry all the time. People who say like, well, what am I supposed to say instead? And my answer is always like, I don't know. What is your sentence about? What is your story about? Is your sentence really about 2/3 of the world where billions and billions of people live? Or are you talking about something more specific? If you're talking about GDP, say that. If you're talking about people in a very specific part of the world, like the North Kivu province of Democratic Republic of Congo, yeah, say that, right? Precision is the way that we get the fix here. In the style guide, we also think and talk a lot about labels. Labels that really distill someone's identity down to something that has happened to them. So victim, survivor, you have the entry up for refugee, right? These are words with really specific definitions, but also when misused, they really allow readers to, again, make a set of assumptions that is not accurate and is generally not purposeful for the story. So the fix here is we really train our reporters to shift to the verb in sentences, right? So rather than saying, someone is an illegal immigrant, someone may have crossed the border without legal documentation, right? Not that someone is a survivor of domestic violence, but that somebody endured X type of violence in a home situation for X amount of time, right? Like really being precise is the key. As Lakshmi mentioned, so much of international journalism is about people that it isn't for, that we can get away with it, right? We can get away with these like really generic terms to describe people all over the world. But for us at Global Press, we are covering our local communities. Our reporters are local journalists first, who also happen to cover who happen to serve a very large global audience as well. But we truly believe that people have a right to recognize themselves in stories. And when we use words that allow people to recognize themselves in stories, they will naturally trust that journalism more. Right? So there is such a link between word choice and worldview, word choice and trust in journalism. So we encourage everyone to take a look at the Global Press Style Book. There are now more than 100 news organizations and NGOs who have adopted the Global Press Style Guide.
Wow.
It is a free available resource that we'd love to see more and more people using.
And you also do some outreach or training, or you're helping develop diversity and inclusion style guides. This came up in a conversation with a colleague, Susan McGregor at the Data Science Institute at Columbia, on how to have some ability in the United States when there's a rapid breaking news story like the shooting in the South a couple of years ago at a Korean massage parlor, where how do you avoid this sort of quick jump to words that are problematic? And I think this idea of getting this tool, or this, it's more like a practice than a tool. That's what I think is really cool about it. Even in just experiencing it a couple of years ago, to me, it then just makes your mind a little bit more attuned, a little bit more mindful to choosing words generally. So can you talk, maybe Lakshmi, can you talk about the sort of exporting the model and how this?
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for pulling this up, Andy. So, I think the essence of our style guide is really about an ethos of dignity and precision, as Cristi was mentioning. And so what we help other organizations do is determine their own word choice decision-making principles. And we leverage the decision-making principles that we've designed for our style guide to help others represent the communities and people they work with, or they report on, or they write about in a very dignified and precise way. And so we at Global Press News Services, which is the B2B division of Global Press, where we're able to kind of take the very best assets of Global Press, what we've spent 16 years defining, developing and innovating around to other organizations around the world. And so two of those services that I think many organizations can benefit from. One are our style guide services. We do incredible workshops rooted in these language decision-making principles, language equity, how to represent communities that you're working with. And that is available on globalpressnewsservices.com. And then there's our duty of care services. We'd love to talk a little bit more about our duty of care. It is industry leading. And what's exciting now is that we're able to take those principles and share them with other organizations to roadmap and build their own duty of care programs to prioritize the wellness of their staff around the world. And
Dale can get into this too, because he's run a couple of sessions on journalism and trauma, like in the traumas that journalists endure, and of course female journalists. And one thing that, again, really is valuable for me to understand how you've evolved this project is that, unlike parachute journalists, the women who are doing the reporting, they can't evacuate. They're in a community they live in. So the flip side of that is they can be vulnerable. So you just got you got an award here. Like the other things on this list from Fast Company are the Ford F-150 Lightning, electric pickup. The UN has a really good project on misinformation, eco-friendly funerals, and then there's duty of care. And it's just, tell us a little bit about how that evolved and what it's about. And Dale, I'd love you to sort of, come in with some reactions and thoughts after.
Yeah, definitely. So at Global Press, duty of care means something really specific. It is all about looking at the interconnection of physical, emotional, digital, and legal security for women journalists for whom extraction is not an option. Right? That's so key. What you said, Andy, that extraction is not an option. Like, even if we made it an option, even if we landed a helicopter in front of our reporters' houses and said, hey, get on, they're not going, right? Their families are there, their babies are there, like they're not going. So it was incumbent upon us to design a program that offered holistic safety and security to women journalists for whom extraction was not an option. Now, in our industry, not popular to say, but true and necessary to say, that there is dramatic security disparity between local journalists and foreign correspondents, right? For us, it was all about coming up with a really interconnected model that is about 20% training, right? Really important that reporters are trained on that, how to, physical safety, legal safety, digital security, et cetera. About 5% of duty of care is crisis response, because we do work in places where earthquakes shake communities to the ground, volcanoes erupt, unpredictable governments, et cetera. But the vast majority, that 75% of duty of care, is all about risk mitigation in how our newsroom is designed. Our newsroom is literally designed from the ground up to preserve reporter safety and security at every step along the way. Lakshmi mentioned earlier that our newsroom operates under a non-assignment policy. This is both for the benefit of the audience, that we are unearthing stories that that reporters might not otherwise tell if they were under just a traditional assignment policy. It's also an opportunity for reporters to tell stories according to their own risk profiles. Right? We teach our reporters about situational awareness. They have robust check-in procedures, policies, and we also have created some really important services that I think other newsrooms should definitely take note of, namely the Global Press Wellness Network. So we operate news bureaus in places where mental health services are often really, really limited. But we know that, number one, women journalists tend to endure more harassment, both physical and digital harassment. Also, trauma, stress and trauma are real in the field of journalism. So we built the Global Press Wellness Network, which is a network of now more than 30 wellness counselors who speak the languages of our reporters, who are available. We pay them to be available to our reporters for free, unlimited sessions. In 2021, which was a dramatically difficult year to be a journalist, no matter where in the world you were, 85% of our reporters utilize the Wellness Network. That is a dramatic number that just goes to show how difficult this craft is. And I think that the real key to duty of care at Global Press is this mutuality, right? We know that we find security through solidarity with one another. Our reporters have responsibilities, we have responsibilities, and ultimately we have built a network of trusted care with our reporters around the world that allows them to continue to produce exceptional stories under some very, very difficult circumstances.
Have there been close calls, or have there been situations where
Yeah, I think, Andy, we talked about this. I think early in the pandemic, that this moment of the pandemic has really been fascinating for duty of care around the world. I think now organizations are starting to really think about, how do we keep our people safe? And this has been something we've been thinking about for more than a decade. And it's great that this has been a forcing mechanism, but it's really a wake-up call for a lot of organizations. And so, though, we've weathered the Ebola epidemic in DRC, that we've dealt with the Easter Sunday bombings in Sri Lanka, we're dealing with this pandemic, we're dealing with things like authoritative governments that make it really difficult to access press passes, and issue really confusing information about what is free and what is unfree. And so we have to navigate these things every day through a trusting relationship with our reporters. And I think part of this, as Cristi mentioned, is it's solidarity. We have your back every step of the way, and we trust you to hyper localize our duty of care response. What we're doing in DRC for a first aid kit looks very different in terms of what we're doing for a first aid kit in Mongolia, right? So we hyper localize our approach as well to make it relevant.
So Dale, you dealt with this. You've actually dealt with this on the ground in South Sudan, and you've dealt with it recently here in Colombia too. What comes to mind thinking about the wider challenges in this arena that people aren't really acknowledging so far?
Well, I'll be very open. I come from this as someone who's had therapy for experiences that I've had in the field. It's interesting. This whole it's until recently, no country really dealt with this. The expectation as I was growing up in journalism was, just suck it up. You're tough. Your job is to report, and you need to be there with people, and it's important to do this, and then you go on to the next one. It's only recently that even in the US, news organizations have taken this seriously, and they've done quite well now. They have helplines that anybody can call, not anonymously, but not reported to your employer if you have issues. But the vast majority of the world, this still hasn't happened. And as you say, there are even greater difficulties for women because they face challenges that men don't. There are cultural conditions that may mean that they can't be open, they can't be strong, they can't vocalize without being challenged. I mean, there are all sorts of things that can create the stress. But what that culture of journalism did for a long time, the idea that you just suck it up, in the US we say cowboy up, get yourself back up on the horse and keep going, it's isolating. It's very isolating because then you're afraid to talk to people about it. You won't say to your employer that you're having this difficulty because you might get fired. There are all these isolating factors here which compound the stress and the difficulties you're already facing. So particularly mental health is incredibly important for people, for journalists. And I would argue when news organizations think about this, still they think about, well, when you're covering a war, when you're covering conflict of some kind. But there's all sorts of stresses separate from that. What Andy has up there right now, moral injury, is the concept that journalists now talk about PTSD, and that's labeled as a mental illness. There's something less severe, but just as suffering, and that's the idea of moral injury, of doing something that goes against your moral code. And the standard example of that is the photographer sitting on the shores of the Mediterranean, seeing a boat of people from a country trying to get into Europe or something, and it's collapsing, and it's just far enough offshore that they really can't swim out. But the calculation is, do I put my camera down, do I swim out and try and save somebody, or do I take photos and try and tell the world about it? And you take photos, but it violates your moral code that says you should help. So now you've got this injury, this internal injury, this mental injury that says that I've failed and I've done something wrong. And this can happen in many different circumstances. It doesn't have to be conflict. And that's, I think, the next step that many journalist organizations need to understand. And that's where you guys are already heading. You're sort of leading in this role in recognizing that this problem can come not just from being around gunfire.
Absolutely.
You mentioned photography, and I know it's another interesting innovation is that you've really stressed photo training from the very beginning too. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so all of our reporters are trained photojournalists, and really this goes to the heart of dignity and precision as well, right? So much of the world where we have bureaus, that photographs available from those regions tend to be extremely stereotypical, really poverty focused. So at Global Press Journal, all of our reporters are trained photojournalists, and they take photos that go with their own stories. So they are able to, what Andy's showing now is a feature photo section of our website. It's called Connected. And essentially it's like, they're just shots from around the communities where we work, really giving people an idea of, the innovations, the families, the culture that make these places what they are. Part of our hope is to really destigmatize a lot of the communities where we work, right? Places like Mexico that are typically covered only in terms of, corruption, cartels, immigration. We are able to present a really rounded version of these communities, thanks in large part to our photojournalism.
And this is available as kind of a news service too, is that right?
It is, yeah. So we have now nearly 1 million photos in the Global Press Journal archive, which is a service that through Global Press News Services, Lakshmi does license and is available for other groups to use. We have research institutions, textbook companies that often come to us looking for really precise photos that really capture the dignity of the people in these communities.
Does this also serve as an assignment bureau in a sense? If a textbook company came and said, we're looking for this particular photo and you don't have it, can you say, we'll get that for you?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean,
Absolutely.
and in almost every case, we do have it. We have a really interesting and unique archive.
That's interesting.
And Andy, you'll find this funny. We actually get a lot of organizations saying, I'm tired of looking at the solar panel in sub-Saharan Africa on a hut. Show me some people, show me some dignity, and what do you have in your archive? And we can always find something much more dignified and precise.
That's so interesting. And again, having women who are embedded in the community, the access and trust is there as well.
Yep, absolutely.
And it's about vision. It's about someone from another country comes in, they don't understand the culture. They don't see the shots. They don't even know what to look for. And that's a huge element of that. It's portrayal of the country as it exists, not as someone coming in believes it to be.
Oh, absolutely.
So I wanted to bring up the future. We've done some projects together. We had a Heinz Foundation grant for some climate risk training. It is still foundation supported mostly, I think, but and we all are looking at this question of, can we get beyond Craig Newmark or all the great people who are devoting resources to this? Is there a way for this to just be the way things are, the way people get stuff, and it's affordable and sustainable? What's that look like?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it has to be, right? And also, Craig, if you're listening, but there has to be a way for us to move beyond just the nonprofit model. Interestingly, also from that that survey I was mentioning that we did of people based in the United States, our readers last year, there is a very low percentage of people within the United States that even understand the concept of nonprofit journalism, right? It's about 4% of people in a nationwide sample that were really familiar with this notion of nonprofit journalism. So I think that we have a lot of work to do in really making sure that our audiences deeply understand the different business models. But ultimately, as I always say, like, nonprofit is not a business model, right? It's a tax status. And so I think that we have to really be careful as nonprofit newsrooms that we are seeking out revenue in a way that is, one, really consistent with our values, and two, sets us up to not be reliant on philanthropic trends, right? As a global news organization, it happens every couple of years where philanthropy has a really vested interest in one particular region of the world or another, and then that interest wanes and goes somewhere else. And so it's not actually feasible for us to build a business model that is solely reliant on philanthropic trends. We are unique at Global Press in that about 90% of our philanthropic dollars are general operating. We also require 100% of our funders to put at least 3% of their gifts towards duty of care. So, we also have a really stringent gift acceptance policy. We don't accept anonymous donations. We don't accept any government funding. So, we have that as a baseline, but where I think Lakshmi can talk a little bit about the innovation that is Global Press News Services, which is really looking to push sustainability to the next level.
And there, as I mentioned, over 16 years, we've done the hard work to figure out how to get this model right, how to build that style guide, how to bring dignified and precise language to other organizations, how to build a holistic safety and security program for other organizations, how to, really, bring incredible photojournalism from around the world. So really leveraging what is the core ethos of our organization, dignity and precision, to other organizations with some really key tools that we are producing, developing, and have spent the time building over the last over a decade that we can offer to other organizations. So these are all values aligned products and services that we use every day in our newsroom and that make us a better organization. And we're now able to help other organizations leverage them as well. So
is that component for profit or envisioned as moving into that they call it B Corp or?
Yes, well, it's not a B Corp, but this is an earned revenue service model. So all of the services that we're talking about, the style guide workshops, it is a fee for service. However, what we're seeing is there are a lot of foundations that are interested in these services, large foundations that are also interested in providing this to smaller newsrooms that they might be funding, to smaller nonprofits that they might be funding. We're seeing this. There's also an interest for this in the private sector, right? We all have to employ people around the world and keep them safe. Sure. And so these aren't just services that, the nonprofit sector is purchasing, that we're seeing this interest in the private sector. Cristi mentioned, education companies, textbooks, also, think tanks, other research institutions. And that's what's really the beauty of Global Press News Services, because we're really relying on values aligned products and services that we're already using every day. We're able to really find and seek other organizations that are looking to be more values aligned And we can help them do that with our services and along the way earn revenue to support the operations of Global Press.
Yeah. Well, you wouldn't be the first entity that started out as one thing and ended up actually prospering or thriving around some component that grew out of that thing. Apple did that. They weren't a music industry business when they started, and Steve Jobs said, "Well, we could be," and they became that too. So this kind of thing can happen, and it's great that you have the entrepreneurial, ethos as well. Getting back to this question of the future of the journalism, though, let's just quickly go around the arena of other efforts. I am a big fan of Earth Journalism Network, which is a little older, maybe a couple of years older, and they have this. They became kind of a seed bed for some really interesting innovations, not just training and networking journalists, but they created Gustavo Fileros, who was based in Brazil, created a map journalism template that now is like all over the place. There's Mekong Eye, there's a Third Pole, Info Amazonia, and they're pretty much they're still nonprofit, but they have this model of looking at, like, one of my favorites is Info Nile. Oh yeah, where it's based on the watershed of the Nile River. So it's something like 8 countries and journalists in all those different cultures and countries, but they're connected by the water that is the Nile watershed. And they do individual projects, but they also do kind of coordinated, collaborative stories together. And there's, of course, a Report for America here is trying to do some of this as well. When you look at the landscape and think about the reporting and storytelling part of what you're doing, what does the future look like?
So, I mean, I think, look, in the space, we've known for a long time that the future of the industry is partnership, right? I think where we have, historically really thrived was with our partnerships within local coverage communities, right? So we have local radio stations, local media partners, local WhatsApp channels, local NGOs, all distributing our stories within the community. And increasingly, there is a growing demand. It's one, I think positive benefit of the pandemic is, as parachute journalists or extractive journalists, as Dale called them, were really grounded because of COVID. A lot of media organizations started looking to local journalists like ours around the world for coverage of the world. So you'll see what the story that you're looking at here on the top of our homepage is, some of the global ripple effects from the war in Ukraine. We're seeing it in terms of inflation, food security. So this is this feature on the homepage is part of a special series that our reporters around the world are doing right now. So we are really seeing greater interest from US-based and European-based news organizations really looking to get stories of the world without necessarily relying on that traditional parachute model, which is super exciting, particularly because the stories that reporters like ours can unearth are truly extraordinary, right? This coverage from Mongolia is a great example. And Andy, as you mentioned, you helped us put together a training for our reporters all about covering climate vulnerabilities that we put to our reporters in 2019 and 2020. And the kinds of stories that our reporters are now telling, thanks to that training, are really, really unique. So speaking of Mongolia, one of my favorite stories that definitely came as an offshoot of that training is one of our reporters who's in the Kuvgul province in Mongolia, which is the northernmost province of Mongolia, borders Russia. Our reporter there, Dolgorova, told a story last year about, Mongolia has built this really interconnected road network, more than 15,000 kilometers of road built since 1998. These roads are built on a foundation of permafrost. The permafrost is melting. And so as a result, Mongolia's entire roadway network, which was a huge part of the country's transition to a market economy in the 90s, is falling apart. So her story that features all local sources, government sources, but also the people whose job it is to repair the roads really consistently because the permafrost is sinking and the roads are sinking with it, or it's melting. So, that's a kind of story that not only are we able to find and cover, but also we'll be able to continue to cover it over the long term, right? At the Dogi produced the story last November, and the real takeaway from the story is Mongolia needs to devote more money to its roads. But with the coronavirus and now the ripple effects of the war in Ukraine, that country is facing severe economic crisis. So that's clearly not going to happen, right? So our reporters are really skilled at weaving together stories of, of economics, environment, human rights, all together.
Yeah, and that flips it from, too often I see journalists from the global north, dare I say.
The reverse doesn't work either, Andy.
No, I know. It was a joke. Journalists from big media focus on the big story, global warming. And to me, it's so inefficacious to do that, because if your story is the climate crisis and you're not defining, well, who's in crisis, what's driving it, where do you go? That every one of those points is suddenly a very crystalline, concrete, actionable story. And they don't always, and actually most often don't fit that general narrative of global warming, which is
so true.
The atmosphere is filling with CO2, shame on Exxon, which is a big story and an important one, but that's not the story on the ground. The vulnerability drivers or solutions are really on the ground. So I think that's, I'm glad to hear that that's happening. And I wish
a couple.
Sorry.
So no, just a couple quick things, if I could. Back to the funding, the idea of where funding comes from. I'm curious, in the U.S. specifically with funders for so long, and with the public, we've done such a poor job as journalists explaining what it is that we do and the significance of it and the importance. In the U.S., I'll talk to people today and they'll say, well, we never appointed you guardians under the First Amendment. Well, it is the First Amendment. This is like an inviolable sort of part of our Constitution, and yet people have forgotten this. And the same thing seems to go for funding. They don't quite understand why it's important to have these voices there and these stories told. Are you running into that? And is part of your goal in looking for funding, in a sense, taking time to educate them about the importance of this?
100%. And, here's the good news. Today, the philanthropic landscape is so different than it was 16 years ago. I can't tell you the number of rooms I have been laughed out of over the last 16 years with the notion that representation in journalism matters, that women becoming storytellers of record matters, that comprehensive coverage of some of the least covered parts of the world matters, right? Now, I founded Global Press when I was 25. And so the number of head taps and be on your way, little girls that I got from major foundations in the United States was not cute. Right now, I will say that probably about 80% of those are now funders of Global Press, which is, I think, a testament to two things. One is that we do invest in donor education. We do invest in reader education, media literacy, helping people understand why representative cores of journalists telling stories from places that they might not know matter, but do matter, why that is an ingredient that will absolutely change the course of our world going forward. And number two, I think particularly over the last 2.5 years during the pandemic, the world has really changed, right? The world has absolutely changed. All of a sudden, conversations about representation are met with yeah, I think so too, instead of I don't get what that is, right? So I think the world is really changing. And I think that ordinary citizens and also philanthropists and foundations do really have a greater understanding of why access to independent information matters, right? When you look at the Global Press model, there is a human rights case for Global Press. There's a climate case for Global Press, right? There's a migration case for Global Press. There is an equity and employment, business model case for Global Press. Whatever it is, I think we're really telling that story in a way that helps funders understand how to get on board and just how deeply it really does matter.
And I would say that number three, of course, is that you're persistent and that you don't seem to take no for an answer. I want to throw in one other quick thing, if I could, before we wrap up, and that's a story I meant to tell around duty of care that I forgot to mention. And to me, one of the biggest services you're offering is this duty of care. And I talked about the isolation, that you're supposed to be a tough person and you're supposed to just suck it up and deal with this. And that creates immense isolation. I was training journalists from what was then called Burma. And one guy, the first 3 days, he looked like he was going to explode. He was so tense. He was so nervous. He didn't say a word, literally not one word for 3 days. And suddenly, he just asked this question. And this is all through interpreters. But he said, so what do you do if you have a story that's very important to tell, but if you do, someone will be killed? And my response first off was, well, of course, I come from a country where we're blessed that we don't face those sorts of decisions very often. But when you say someone is going to be killed, I'm wondering if you're saying that's someone from your family. And he nodded. And I said, the best thing you can do is talk to the people around you. And that led to a 2-hour conversation with his peers, and he found out he wasn't alone. The whole point was he was in isolation, he was stressed. Just a conversation with his peers about this, he found out they'd faced similar things, and they could have that conversation and talk and try and understand how to address that sort of a situation. I mean, that's such an unusual and unique problem that we fortunately don't face on a regular basis, but people in some countries do. And that's the power of duty of care. That conversation that you create is more powerful in helping people through these sorts of struggles than anything else you can do. So I'm immensely and hugely grateful that you're offering that.
I think we all are. So we're kind of at the tail end here, and I try to end with like, so what can we do together that is harder to do individually? And I don't just mean Colombia and you guys, but if there's some conversation iterating from what we talked about today, who would be in the room? Who can we? What can we do? You only mentioned like WhatsApp stations, and I think I've talked to Dale for many times about SMS and these other ways of telling stories. I just did a session, I wrote a piece recently about how Twitter in Indonesia, the flood agencies are now using Twitter as a live sensory system across Jakarta. So it's a two-way one too. So people post a picture, the Twitter data shows where there's rapid flooding, and the community can get insights on where it's worse and what to do. That frontier, just the social media one, is something I think I'd happily do another session with you. But who should be in the room? Where do we go from here? Just quickly go around.
I think it's twofold, right? I think that one, I wish we were able to get some of our reporters on with you today. We should definitely do that in the future, because hearing directly from them is like the greatest thing. So I think really those connections between local journalists and then mainstream outlets, right? I mentioned that we are having some success in getting our stories placed in prominent US and European based outlets, but not enough. There is still real stereotype and bias that I think prevents legacy media organizations from pursuing relationships with organizations like ours that do solely employ local journalists. So I think that the more we can get local reporters and legacy outlets in the same room together, it becomes so incredibly obvious about the mutual benefit and just how much local journalists have to bring to the table.
That sounds great. Well, we should talk about that. And we do know a few people at some of the bigger media. Anything, Lakshmi, from your standpoint?
No, I think just broadly speaking, the industry is great at pointing out all of the problems that we have. How many reporters have been killed, how many reporters have been suppressed, the lack of women in news sources, the lack of women in reporting. And I really encourage us to, there are models like Global Press where we are addressing so many aspects of trust in journalism, sustainability in journalism, in terms of representation, in terms of safety and security. And the more we can talk about a way forward, leveraging our model and all of the expertise we've built, I think so many other news organizations and the industry at large can benefit.
Well, that's great. Well, it's been wonderful to catch up with you. It was 2 years or so ago. I had Lakshmi on here with a couple of your journalists from other parts of the world, Sri Lanka and South Africa, I believe, or Zimbabwe. Right. And we could do this quarterly at the very least. And we'll think about that idea of how do we maximize the uptake of what you're doing, both the journalism itself and the practices, which again I think are just amazingly innovative. I'm just going to close out by showing that 1 minute film one more time. This is Andy Revkin, the Columbia Climate School, with Dale Willman, my colleague, with Cristi Hegranes, and with Lakshmi Partha. Oh God, I don't have your name right in front of me.
Partha.
There you go. Dale got it. Who's the COO? Let's just keep this going forward. And thank you for being part of this Sustain What show today. And this gets shared, archived right away on all those platforms to be shared later.
The world.
Thank you so much, Andy and Dale.
Thank you.
Journalism. And that in order to truly change the storyteller would also have to change.
За миний нэр Арлаа гэдэг Америк улбас пресс журналын сурвалжлагчаар Монгол улсад 1 жил ажиллаж байгаа.
Natsanzi Segawa, Global Press Journal reporter in Uganda for 5 years.
Shilu Mananda, Global Press Journal reporter in Nepal for 10 years.
Global Press Journal reporter in Zimbabwe.
Reporto para el medio Global Press Journal desde Puerto Rico.
In Argentina,
In Zambia.
Chiapas, Mexico.
in Zimbabwe for 5 years.
We all feel we belong to this amazing team. Through what we learned at Global Press, it has brought us together as one family.
As readers continue to demand equity, inclusion, and better representation from media, these extraordinary reporters will continue to lead the way, bravely reporting untold stories so that we can better understand each other and better understand our world.
The world needs a new model of international.
So thank you again for being here today. And please, if you're watching, share this with folks as soon as we're done. Weigh in. You can reach me through the info with that little scrolling distracting bar at the bottom. And stay tuned. Have a good weekend.
Thanks, everyone.